13-year-old Jamal Carter often got lost in thought during class. One sunny autumn day in Atlanta, Georgia, as the chatter-filled classroom of Riverside Middle School settled down for math, Jamal sat quietly by the window, staring outside. He wasn't uninterested, quite the opposite. Jamal loved numbers. He found comfort in solving complex problems, but the slow pace of the lessons left him bored. His notebook was mostly empty, except for the margins, where he'd scribble advanced equations just for fun. Mrs. Amanda Thompson, their strict and experienced teacher, had grown frustrated. Many students had done poorly on the recent math test, and she was tired of seeing Jamal distracted. Wanting to make a point, she suddenly called on him. "Jamal, come up and solve this," she said, writing a problem on the board far beyond what the class had been learning. Some students laughed. Others whispered, doubting he could do it. What they didn't know was that Jamal was a math genius. He stood up slowly, walked to the board, and studied the problem. The room fell quiet. With calm confidence, he picked up the chalk and began to solve it, step by step, line by line. By the time he finished, the board was covered in clean, logical steps. The answer was correct. A stunned silence filled the room. Mrs. Thompson raised an eyebrow, then smiled slightly. "Very impressive, Jamal." For the first time, the class saw him differently. Not as the quiet kid in the back, but as someone extraordinary. Talented he really was. As Jamal stood at the board, the class watched, some laughing, others skeptical. But Jamal was about to surprise them all. Mrs. Thompson didn't accept average work. Seeing so many low scores on the recent test made her question whether her students were truly putting in the effort. She picked up the stack of graded tests and began calling out names, handing them back with brief comments. "Good job," to a few, and "You need to study more," to most. When she reached Jamal's desk, she paused. His test was on top, a bright red 100% circled at the top. Though he'd earned perfect scores before, his frequent daydreaming during class still irritated her. Without a word, she handed him the test, her lips pressed in a firm line, and turned away. "All right, listen up." Mrs. Thompson's voice cut through the remaining chatter, and the room quickly fell silent. She placed the stack of tests on her desk and leaned against it, arms crossed, surveying the room. "Most of you did okay," she said, though her tone hinted at disappointment. "But many of you are still struggling with concepts we've been covering for weeks." Jamal, barely listening, rested his chin on his hand, his gaze drifting once again toward the window. Jamal stared out the window, more interested in the rustling autumn leaves than in Mrs. Thompson's lecture. He didn't notice her sharp eyes turning toward him as she continued speaking. "This is basic algebra," she said, her voice rising slightly. "You need to understand this if you want to do well in high school, college, or life in general." She paused, her gaze locking onto Jamal's distracted face. A flicker of irritation crossed her expression. "Jamal Carter!" she snapped, her voice cutting through the classroom noise like a knife. Jamal jumped, his hand slipping from his chin. Heads turned in his direction as the room fell silent. His heart pounded, and his cheeks flushed with heat. "Yes, ma'am," he mumbled, barely audible. Mrs. Thompson narrowed her eyes. "You seem very interested in what's happening outside," she said, nodding toward the window. "Care to share what's so fascinating?" Jamal opened his mouth to respond, but quickly closed it, unsure of what to say. A few students chuckled under their breath, but Mrs. Thompson didn't smile. "Let's see if you've been paying attention," she said sharply. "Come up here." The room went completely still. Jamal stood up slowly, the screech of his chair loud against the quiet. His classmates watched him with a mix of amusement and curiosity. Some whispered under their breath, "She's going to roast him." While some students watched in silence, others laughed quietly. "He never talks. He doesn't even know what's going on," one student muttered. Jamal's palms were sweaty as he made his way to the front of the room. He could feel every eye on him, making the short walk to the whiteboard feel like a mile. Mrs. Thompson stood beside the board, marker in hand, her expression unreadable. "Let's see how much you've been paying attention," she said, and began writing a complex equation across the board. It was far beyond anything the class had learned so far. Intimidating, but not impossible for someone with Jamal's skills. She stepped aside and held the marker out to him. "Go ahead," she said, her tone sharp, almost daring. "Show us what you've got." Jamal took the marker, its cool, plastic firm in his grip. He stared at the equation as his mind raced. The whispers and quiet snickers behind him only added to the weight pressing down on his chest. For a second, he wanted to turn around and sit back down. But then he thought of all the nights he'd spent solving problems just like this for fun. This wasn't about Mrs. Thompson, and it wasn't about his classmates. It was about him, and what he knew he could do. Jamal took a deep breath, raised the marker, and began to write. The classroom seemed to close in around him, the air thick with silence. The marker suddenly felt heavier in his hand, but his focus sharpened. With each passing second, Jamal stared at the board. The equation was a complex mix of variables, exponents, and fractions, something most eighth graders wouldn't encounter yet. It was obvious Mrs. Thompson had chosen it to challenge him. Behind him, the class whispered and giggled. "No way he's solving that," one boy muttered. "He doesn't even know where to start," another added, laughing quietly. Jamal's shoulders tensed, but he didn't turn around. He kept his eyes on the board, letting the noise fade into the background. The problem was difficult, sure, but it wasn't unfamiliar. Bit by bit, the pieces started coming together in his mind. His heart still pounded, but beneath the nerves, something else stirred. Determination. He knew he could do this. He just needed to focus. At her desk, Mrs. Thompson stood with her arms crossed, watching him closely, one eyebrow raised. To her, this moment wasn't just about solving a problem. It was a test of his attention, his discipline. She had always been frustrated by Jamal's habit of zoning out, especially since she knew he was bright. Now, she wanted proof of what he could really do when challenged. "Well," she said, breaking the silence. "We're waiting." Jamal inhaled deeply and raised the marker. His writing was slow and cautious at first, but as he worked through the problem, his confidence grew. His hand moved more steadily, his mind fully locked in. The class, expecting him to freeze or fail, began to quiet down. Murmurs of surprise rippled across the room as they realized Jamal wasn't struggling. He was solving it. "Wait, is he actually solving it?" a girl whispered. "Looks like it," her friend replied, leaning forward in disbelief. Jamal's mind raced, breaking the complex equation into smaller, manageable steps. He simplified the fractions, isolated the variables, and crossed out the clutter. The marker squeaked softly against the board as his hand moved faster and more confidently. He wasn't just solving the problem. He was owning it. The room grew still. Whispers died down. Even the boy who had laughed earlier now sat frozen, his mouth slightly open. Behind Jamal, Mrs. Thompson's expression began to shift. She had expected hesitation, maybe even failure, but instead, she was watching something else entirely. He wasn't just doing it right. He was doing it flawlessly. Jamal paused for a moment to double-check his work. Then, With a calm final motion, he circled the answer and clicked the marker closed. When he turned around, the silence in the room was deafening. Every eye was on him, even the kids who rarely paid him any attention. Some stared with wide eyes, others with jaws slightly dropped. Mrs. Thompson walked up slowly, her heels tapping against the floor. She examined the board closely, tracing his steps with her finger. Her lips moved silently as she checked the math, her brow furrowed in concentration. Then, gradually, her expression softened. Finally, Mrs. Thompson turned to face him. Her expression was hard to read, a mixture of surprise, thoughtfulness, and something else Jamal hadn't seen from her before. Respect. "This is correct," she said, her voice quieter than usual. A wave of disbelief rippled through the classroom. A few students began clapping, unsure at first, then more joined in. Soon, the room echoed with applause. Jamal stood frozen, uncertain of what to do. His cheeks flushed, but this time it wasn't embarrassment. It was something else. Something unfamiliar. Pride. As the clapping faded, Mrs. Thompson turned back to the class. "What you just saw wasn't luck," she said, pointing to the board. "This is what it looks like when someone truly understands the material. Jamal didn't just solve the problem, he broke it down step by step and made it look effortless. That's real understanding." Her words hung in the air, and for the first time, Jamal didn't feel like disappearing into the background. Instead, he stood a little taller, hands relaxed at his sides. "Jamal," Mrs. Thompson said gently, her voice now softer, "if you can do this, why do you stay so quiet? Why sit in the back and never speak up?" Jamal hesitated. He glanced down at his sneakers. He didn't know how to explain it. How could he put into words the fear of standing out? The comfort of being invisible? After a long pause, Jamal simply shrugged. "I didn't think anyone noticed," he said quietly. Mrs. Thompson's expression softened. "Well," she said gently, "it's time for that to change." As Jamal walked back to his seat, the sound of the applause still echoed in his ears. A strange warmth settled over him, something between disbelief and relief. Around him, his classmates exchanged whispers, sneaking glances in his direction. But this time, their eyes weren't mocking or dismissive. They were curious, respectful. Mrs. Thompson stood silently at the front of the room, her hands clasped in thought. She wasn't a teacher who was easily impressed, but today, Jamal had done more than solve a difficult problem. He had shifted something. Not just in her, but in the room itself. He had reminded her of something important. That the quiet ones, the ones who sit in the back and rarely speak, often carry the loudest brilliance. "Class," she said, her voice rising above the whispers, "today was a reminder. Everyone in this room has potential. Jamal didn't just solve an equation. He showed us what focus, persistence, and true understanding look like." Jamal sat at his desk, gripping his notebook. His heart had finally slowed, but his mind was still racing. With thoughts, with pride, with possibility. He hadn't planned for this. Solving equations in the margins of his notebook had always been his quiet escape. Something he did for himself, not for praise or attention. But now, for the first time, people were noticing. And that felt both thrilling and terrifying. A girl sitting in front of him turned around, eyes wide. "How did you do that?" she asked, her voice full of wonder. Jamal hesitated. I just figured it out," he said softly. "That was crazy," another student chimed in. "Are you like a genius or something?" Jamal's face flushed. He quickly shook his head. "No, I just really like math." The bell rang, cutting through the moment. As students began filing out, several paused to pat him on the back or say, "That was awesome." Jamal nodded, a little overwhelmed, clutching his notebook like a shield. He wasn't used to this kind of attention. Part of him wanted to disappear again, to return to the quiet corners he knew so well. But another part, small, glowing, felt something new. Pride. "Jamal, can you stay for a moment?" Mrs. Thompson called, as the last student slipped out the door. He took a breath and nodded. Things were changing. And maybe, just maybe, that wasn't such a bad thing. Mrs. Thompson leaned against her desk, studying him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Jamal?" she began, her voice softer than before. "I owe you an apology," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice soft but serious. Jamal blinked, unsure if he'd heard her correctly. "An apology?" he asked, his voice tentative. She nodded. "I've been teaching for a long time," she began, choosing her words carefully. "I like to think I know my students. But with you," she paused, then met his eyes. "I misjudged you. I thought you were quiet, because you weren't interested. I assumed you didn't care. But I was wrong." Jamal shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "It's okay," he mumbled, unsure how to respond. "No," she said firmly. "It's not okay. You have a gift, Jamal. And I don't want to see you hide it. Do you know how rare it is for someone your age to solve a problem like that? To think the way you do?" Jamal looked down at his notebook, his fingers tracing the familiar worn edges. "I don't know," he said quietly. "I just like doing it. It makes sense to me." Mrs. Thompson's smile was warm, almost proud. "That's exactly what makes it special. You see things differently. That's something to be proud of. But here's the thing. You can't keep it to yourself. There are programs, competitions, and advanced classes that could help you learn even more. I'd love to help you find them, if you're interested." Jamal's heart skipped a beat. The thought of learning more, of pushing his skills even further, was exciting, but also a little overwhelming. It felt like an entirely new world opening up before him, but it also felt a little scary. Jamal thought about standing at the board, how the equation had come together, and how everything had felt so different afterward. Could he really do more? Could he be more? I don't know," he admitted. "What if I mess up?" Mrs. Thompson's smile was reassuring. "Making mistakes is part of learning," she said gently. "But if you never try, you'll never know what you're capable of." That night, Jamal sat at the small kitchen table in his family's home, his notebook open in front of him. His parents listened intently as he told them everything: the problem, the applause, and Mrs. Thompson's offer. His mother's eyes filled with pride as she reached for his hand. "Jamal," she said softly, "we've always known you were special. I'm so happy others are finally seeing it too." His father nodded, a knowing smile on his face. "This is just the beginning, son. Don't be afraid to show the world what you can do." Jamal spent the rest of the evening staring at the blank page in his notebook. For so long, it had been a space for his private thoughts, problems he solved just for himself, notes no one else ever saw. But now, it felt different. It felt like something more, a space for possibilities. He picked up his pencil, hesitated for a moment, then began to write. Not just equations, but ideas, goals, and dreams. For the first time, he wasn't afraid of being noticed. He was ready to move forward, ready to see where his talent could take him. The next day, the classroom felt different. The air seemed lighter, charged with the promise of something new. Jamal walked in a little taller, his eyes focused not just on the math in front of him, but on the future that was now wide open. Jamal, the quiet kid who used to blend into the background, was now the center of attention. As he walked in, his classmates greeted him with nods, smiles, and even a few high fives. "Yo, Jamal," a boy called from the back. "That was crazy yesterday. How'd you even do that?" Jamal hesitated. His usual instinct was to stay quiet, to avoid the attention. But today felt different. He felt a new sense of pride bubbling up inside him. "I just worked through it," he said, sliding into his usual seat by the window. "That wasn't just working through it," a girl added, leaning forward. "You made it look easy. You're like a math wizard or something." Jamal's face grew warm. He shrugged but couldn't help the smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Thanks," he muttered, his voice still humble but sincere. Even students who had never spoken to him before were now curious. Some asked for help with their homework. Others simply wanted to know more about what he was good at. For the first time, Jamal felt like he wasn't invisible. Mrs. Thompson entered the room, glancing at him with a small, approving smile before starting the lesson. When she called on him to answer a question, her voice was encouraging, not strict. Jamal hesitated for a second, but then he answered clearly and confidently. The class murmured in quiet awe. Mrs. Thompson nodded in satisfaction. "Excellent," she said, her voice warm. "That's the kind of thinking we need more of," Mrs. Thompson said warmly. After class, Mrs. Thompson asked Jamal to stay behind. She sat on the edge of her desk, her expression thoughtful. "Jamal," she began, "I've been thinking a lot about what we talked about yesterday. You have an incredible talent, and I don't want to see it go to waste." Jamal glanced down at his notebook, his fingers tracing its edges. "I don't really know what to do with it," he admitted quietly. "That's where I can help," Mrs. Thompson replied. "There's an advanced math program at the district level. It's for students who need more of a challenge. The class meets twice a week after school, and I think you'd be a perfect fit." Jamal's eyes widened. The idea of joining an advanced class was exciting, but also overwhelming. "Do you really think I'd be good enough?" he asked, his voice filled with doubt. Mrs. Thompson smiled. "I don't think it. I know you are. You've already proven it. This is a chance for you to explore your potential." She paused. "I even spoke to the program coordinator. They're excited to have you." Jamal thought back to the moment when he'd solved that equation, the way the class had looked at him with newfound respect, and the pride he'd seen in his parents' eyes. Slowly, something inside him began to shift. He nodded, a small but definite feeling of determination settling in. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll do it." The following week, Jamal walked into his first advanced math class, his heart racing with the same nervous excitement he'd felt when standing at the whiteboard. The students from different schools were chatting in small groups, all of them looking confident, competitive even. As the instructor began the lesson, Jamal quickly realized something. He was in the right place. The problems were challenging, the discussions fast-paced, and for the first time, he was surrounded by people who loved math just as much as he did. It was an amazing feeling. Back at Riverside Middle, Jamal's reputation as the math kid began to grow. His classmates came to him for help, not just because he was good at math, but because they respected him. The boy who once felt invisible was now part of something bigger. Mrs. Thompson, too, began to see her students differently. Jamal's journey reminded her that sometimes the quietest students have the most to offer. She started paying more attention to them, encouraging them to step forward in their own ways. One evening, as Jamal sat at the kitchen table, scribbling through a difficult problem from his advanced class, his mother walked in. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, her smile soft but full of pride. "I'm so proud of you, Jamal," she said, her voice filled with warmth. "You've always been special. Now, the world is finally starting to see it too." Jamal looked up at her, a small but genuine smile spreading across his face. "Thanks, Mom," he said quietly. He glanced back down at his notebook, his pencil hovering over the page. For the first time, he realized he wasn't just solving problems for himself. He was building something bigger. One equation, one opportunity, one step at a time. And with that, he knew he was finally ready to step into the light and truly shine.